to Mood Food with Melissa. I'm Melissa, and today we're going to be making my vibrant version of your traditional steak and potatoes dinner. The first thing we're going to start working on is our sweet potatoes, which will end up just being a simple puree made with coconut oil and sea salt only, and you'll be so surprised at how delicious those are. The next thing we'll work on is our pan-fried ribeye, which is going to get the most beautiful crust. We won't need to dredge it or anything to get that. And then the final thing we're gonna do is a beautiful Demi glace. And rather than using butter to get that richness, we're gonna rely on the collagen in the bone broth to get that richness. So it's going to be a really simple recipe in terms of technique and ingredients. So let's get started on our sweet potatoes. I'm using a variation because when you use different colors, you're getting different nutrients. And you can see they're both orange on the inside here, but they're not the same color on the outside. And there's a slightly different color. One's a little more purple, one's a little more red, and that just means that we're gonna be getting different nutrients. And anytime you're getting different colors, you're getting diverse nutrients, and that's just gonna make it better for you. So I'm gonna start by just cutting off the little butts here, but we're not gonna peel these sweet potatoes. And we're not going to peel them for a couple reasons. One being that the skin is the most nutrient dense part of most vegetables, including sweet potatoes. So we definitely don't wanna lose those nutrients. And the other part is, with this recipe, the combination of the coconut oil and the sea salt and the skins and the starchy water that we're gonna reserve from cooking gives this beautiful like marshmallow flavor almost. So that's my favorite part about this recipe. So the skins are essential to that. To cut the sweet potatoes, you're going to want to cut them into, you could use any shape really, but I like to go with a half moon. And I like to do a half moon shape because it allows more liquid to get into the potatoes. And because we're going to reserve all the water, we really want these potatoes to just fall apart and disintegrate into the water. So to do the half moons, you're just gonna cut the sweet potato in half the long way. And if you're concerned about, taking your knife and going straight down like this into a tall potato, just cut them down into shorter pieces that you feel more comfortable working with. You could also use a mandolin. You can also just cube these if that's what makes you feel most comfortable. I'm gonna do these little half moon shapes. And I'm cutting them into very thin slivers because, as I mentioned, we're going to reserve that cooking water. And when we use that water, we actually want these potatoes to just completely disintegrate. And then, so you can see here, we've got them nice and thin. They don't need to be uniform. These are all gonna get blended at the end anyway. So there's no reason to worry about all the potato slices being the same size or anything like that. So I'm just gonna continue through all of these potatoes, carefully cutting them into half moons. And the half moons allow for just maximum liquid absorption, and it's also gonna speed up our cooking time. I know that as much as I love to spend hours in the kitchen when I can, it's just not practical every day. So things being quick and easy is always a bonus for me and something I really strive to put into all of my recipes. So I like to use sweet potatoes rather than a regular potato for a few reasons. I think that we eat with our eyes first, so anytime I can get more color on my plate, I always think that's a nice thing. And I love specifically the Hana and the garnet potatoes because they have this vibrant orange inside. And that, I think, just translates to your brain. When we see vibrant colors, we know that means nutrient density. So our brains love that, and it's gonna make you it makes me at least more satisfied, more enjoying the food when I have just vibrant colors on my plate. I love sweet potatoes as well because they have a lower glycemic index. They don't spike your blood sugar quite the same way as like a traditional potato would in your like French fries or something like that. And they truly just have such great flavor on their own that you really don't need to add things to them the same way that you do need to add to a regular potato. So now that all the sweet potatoes are chopped up in here, I've got them into those little half moon slivers. I'm going to fill the pot with water, basically so that the sweet potatoes are just barely covered. I don't want them to be submerged. I want them to be kind of poking out the top a little bit, that's okay. I don't want them floating or swimming. And the reason for that is that we're going to reserve all of the cooking water, and we're gonna use that as the liquid to blend these in. So we wanna make sure that we don't end up with too much excess water. We can always add more water in if we need to thin out the puree, but if we end up with too much water in the pot, we're gonna lose our nutrients if we have to strain some off, and that's a huge part of what makes this taste so good, is keeping all of that starchy skin water, blending it into the final product. So I'm gonna get the water in there, and then we're gonna get them boiling. So the water in here is just kind of level with the sweet potatoes. None of them are floating, and some of them are even kind of poking out the top, but that's okay. That's exactly how we want this. We're gonna put the lid on, so it's going to help steam the potatoes, which will get them tender, and it's also going to just help speed up our cooking process. So we'll get that on stove here. So our sweet potatoes are in the pot, and we are gonna get started on our steak while we let those do their thing. So the steak that we're going to be making today is a pan-fried ribeye, and this is one of my favorite recipes because it is all about the salty, delicious crust here. And the key to getting a salty, delicious crust is making sure that you have a nice dry steak and a really good salt. So I'm gonna go ahead and get some gloves on for this. And typically at home, or really more often than not, I like to just use my hands bare, but in sake of not wanting to wash my hands 8,000 times while we're doing this together today, I'm just gonna use gloves. And of course you can use them at home, but I'm a big believer, and as my grandmother used to always say, your hands are your best tools in the kitchen. So I like to just work with my hands as much as I can. So this ribeye that we're working with today is beautifully marbled. And that's what you were looking for in a ribeye, is you want to have a nice marbling throughout, and you want to have a nice little fat kind of strip, but you don't want that huge piece of fat kind of going through the middle of the steak, which you'll find on some ribeyes. So this is like an ideal steak for me. This is what I look for when I'm looking for a ribeye. Good marbling, you get some little pockets of fat, but you're really only getting this one big strip here. So as I mentioned, we're gonna need to get this super dry in order to get a good crust. And the reason for that is that when you're pan frying, or really when you're cooking anything, there's liquid inside of the meat, there's liquid inside of whatever you're cooking. And as the heat gets on it, it's gonna release that liquid. So by patting it dry, we're ensuring that we're gonna fry that outside, we're gonna get that beautiful crust, and there won't be any steaming action. And you can tell when there's been steaming because instead of getting a beautiful, rich, caramelized crust, you get like a gray, brown kind of beef, and that's not what we're going for today. So we're gonna get a beautiful, caramelized, crispy, salty crust going, and that starts with a nice dry steak. So you can see it like stuck to the paper towels as I was taking it off, and that's exactly what we're going for. And then we're also gonna use some of this beautiful sea salt, and this sea salt is really the only salt that I use, and it is from Saltery One in Duxbury, and it is my favorite salt because it is both mineral rich and just super pure. It's made from the Island Creek oyster bed, and the oysters on the Island Creek oyster campus, they're filtering the water in the open bay, and as they filter the water, as they breathe the water, they're filtering it, and they're also depositing minerals back into it. So this salt is super mineral rich, and you can taste the minerals. It's not like you taste it and you're like, oh, that tastes like magnesium, or that tastes like selenium, but it does have those little micronutrients that we need that are essential to functions like cognitive function, nerve function, but we don't get them in table salt or salt that's been highly processed. So I really love this salt for its mineral profile and the flavor that that brings. And you can also see that it's a really beautiful flaky sea salt. So that is literally crumbled by hand by the women that work at the salt making lab. And I just love their final product. I think that you can taste the quality that goes into it, the love that goes into it. And really you're getting a lot of health benefits from this salt. I think salt can get such a bad rap because, when it's just pure sodium, that's not really giving you what you need. But our body craves salt for the mineral profile. And that's what we're going to be getting here today. And so I'm putting a good amount of salt here on the outside. And the reason for that is that we're not going to do really any other seasoning to this meat. And you can see I'm really working it into the flesh here. And there's a couple reasons for that. The reason is that it's gonna help the salt to melt into the meat rather than stay in this like crystal form. It's also tenderizing the meat a little bit. So I'm really rubbing that in there, massaging the meat. And you'll see too, as you're doing this, that the meat will start to release a little more liquid, and that's because the salt is drawing the liquid out. So after we get this nice and rubbed in, we're actually gonna give it another pat before it goes in the pan. So we're gonna leave this here for a moment to kind of draw a little more liquid out so that we can get as crispy as a crust as possible. And in the meantime, we're gonna get our pan set up with our coconut oil. So now we're ready to start cooking our steak, and we've let it rest here for a couple of minutes. So you're able to see that there's some liquid drawing out, and we're gonna give it just one more pat before it goes into the pan. And before we put it in the pan, we're gonna just let that hang out for a second. We're gonna add some coconut oil, and I'm gonna add a good amount of coconut oil, but we're not like deep frying. So ideally what you want is you want a good solid layer of coconut oil, but you don't want it to be like swimming in the pan. So this, we're gonna turn down a little bit because the pan is already really nice and hot. And the reason I'm putting my hand in the pan is that's how I know when the temperature is right for searing. If you can hold your hand about an inch over the pan, it's not hot enough. If it's not burning you, it's not gonna do what we want to the meat. So we're gonna get this in there. And we're gonna make sure that it has the oil all around it. And we're gonna let that do its thing. And the reason we want to make sure we're using a good amount of coconut oil in here is because we want to we're frying this. Even though we're not deep frying it, that little portion of the meat that's in the oil, we're frying. And so we need it to be submerged and not just, like typically if I was making something and I didn't want to fry it, I would put just barely enough oil in the pan so that it was covering it. This you want a good solid layer, but you don't want it to be even like cooling, really. I would say you just want it to be a solid covering, but no real depth to it in the pan. And this is not gonna take so long to cook. And it really depends on your stove. I always say that cooking is a conversation with the food. So we're not going to be timing this. We're gonna be looking for things. And I'm gonna adjust the heat here a little bit. And adjusting is part of that conversation with the food. Originally the pan, it was like super, super hot. I didn't want it that hot. This particular stove, it dropped down pretty quickly temperature-wise. So we're just gonna continue to like talk to our food, see what it needs from us. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get a beautiful, deep caramelized crust underneath that steak. And we're gonna know that that's happening just by looking at it. And I can already tell that we're not there yet because I'm looking at the very bottom edges of the steak in the pan, and I can see that they look kind of gray or kind of brown, which tells me that we need a few more minutes here. While the steak is in the pan, what you can do is you don't want to press it like with a steak presser or like a burger press or something like that. But what you can do is just use your tongs to kind of gently press down on the middle of the steak in the pan. And what that's doing is it's helping to prevent any steam pockets from forming. Sometimes what can happen when the steak hits the pan and the steak contracts, it can create like a little pocket in the middle where all that liquid that I mentioned that will come off of the steak, it will kind of pool inside of that little pocket and it will start to steam and it will get like a big gray spot in the middle of your steak rather than a beautiful crust all the way through, which is what we're going for here. One of the things that I like to do and that you'll see me doing here is I'm kind of spinning my steak around in the pan. And this is almost kind of stir frying it. It's allowing me to get really even heat. This particular pan isn't the most even. I do love it for lots of other reasons. But using, again, we're having the conversation with the food, we're having a conversation with our equipment too. So with this particular pan, I find it works best if I keep my steak kind of moving throughout. You don't have to do it that way. I do think that keeping it, after you get that initial sear, keeping it moving in the pan while you're frying it can be a good way to just kind of redistribute some of that heat and prevent burning while getting a really beautiful, even crust. And so that is definitely getting close. And yes, this is exactly what we want. So you can see there, we've got a nice, beautiful crust. We've got a little bit of a steam pocket going, but we're gonna just press that down. And so right now, I'm making sure that I'm pressing down the edges of this steak because it definitely did curl up a little bit on our sear last time. So we just wanna make sure that we're, you know, the food's telling us what's going on. We've gotta listen to what it's telling us. So it's saying that it needs a little more pressure, and we're gonna make sure we do that. And so this right here is what I was talking about your steam pocket. The steam pocket is this little bit of grayness there, and that's from all the liquid getting trapped under the steak. Moving it around in the pan is also helping to prevent that because you're not leaving the steak in one position the entire time it's in the pan. So this steak is already looking really good. I think it's actually already done. I'm gonna just take it out here. We didn't get quite as good of a sear on the second side as I would love, but what's most important to me is getting the temp at the right steak. So we have everything I was looking for, which is this beautiful crust, this beautiful salty crust, and we've got beautiful tender meat on the inside, and that's what we're going for, even if our sear is not exactly where I'd like it to be on both sides. So while we still have the pan nice and hot, we're going to work on our demi glaze, and we're gonna start by deglazing this pan. So right here, I have some bone broth, and this is gonna go straight in here, and it's gonna have quite a little reaction. So we're gonna go ahead and just add all of that bone broth into the pan. So the bone broth that I just added to the pan was in another pan because it had to be melted before I used it. Hale Bone Broth is a local company, and it's made with grass-fed, grass-finished beef bones. And you can see it comes in these beautiful little bricks. And I love that it comes this way because you don't always want to open up a big quart of bone broth for whatever you're making. And you can just pull out like one brick as you need it, or in this case, we're actually gonna use 6 bricks for this recipe. So I have 5 in there now. I'm gonna wait for this to start boiling, and then I'm gonna add this brick just so that I have a good temperature going on here before I add that in. When you add something cold to something hot, it's gonna bring the temperature down, obviously. And for this reduction, we need the temperature hot so that it is boiling, we're getting rid of that liquid, and we're really caramelizing all of that collagen. So we're gonna let this boil. Once it's nice and hot, we're gonna add this in, and then literally all you do for this part of the recipe is just let it boil. And then we're gonna work on our sweet potatoes while we let that happen. So we have those right here, and they sound like they are really ready. Perfect, so these are right where I want them. Regular mashed potatoes, you don't need them to be completely disintegrating, but because we're gonna keep the skins on, and because we want to just blend it really easily, we want them to just be like falling apart like this. So this is perfect, and the liquid looks just about right too. The liquid has reduced down, so we have the perfect texture going on in these sweet potatoes here, which is completely falling apart. And that means that we're gonna be able to use all of this delicious starchy water without having to dilute it down at all. And as I mentioned earlier, that delicious marshmallow flavor that I get in these really comes from that starchy water from the skins being left on during the boiling process. So I don't want to dilute that unless I have to. So we're also gonna wanna make sure that we just give this a chance to cool off a little bit before we transfer it into the blender. We'll wanna do that for a couple of reasons. Obviously, just the blender itself is not gonna do well if we put something that's too hot in it. The other reason is that as you blend it, if it's too hot in the blender, it'll pressurize, it can just be difficult to work with. So we wanna make sure that it's cooled down enough just so that it's let some steam off. It doesn't have to be completely cool or room temperature. You just don't want it to be boiling anymore. So our steak has had a chance to rest a little bit, and why it's so important to let your steak rest before cutting it is that as you're cooking your meat, all of the liquids that I talked about are being released. But because we have that beautiful sear on the outside, we've trapped most of the juices inside. And if we cut it too soon, they haven't had a chance to redistribute back into the meat, so we'll lose a lot of that moisture, and we don't want that. Obviously, some juices are gonna come out when we cut this, but it'll be minimal, and we'll keep most of that flavor inside the meat. So when you cut your meat, you always want to cut it against the grain. And the reason for that is that the fibers of meat can be very tough and they're very long. So by cutting against the grain, you're shortening those fibers and help making the meat more tender. So I'm gonna start really thin here. I like to do very thin slices on my meat. It really just helps with that like melt in your mouth factor. And it really, especially with a ribeye, I think lets the meat shine. Its texture is beautiful. So we did a great job on this steak. It came out so good. We have a nice, beautiful crust. We have a nice pink middle there. All of that beautifulness. Look at that, so good, so yummy. So this is pretty much all we're gonna do with this steak. Because we have that nice, super salty rub on the crust, we don't wanna over season it. I might add a little more salt at the end just because salt when it's cooked into something versus salt added at the end are two different flavors as much as they're still both salt. So this is just kind of the way it's gonna be, and we're gonna leave it alone until it's time to plate. So now that I have my sweet potatoes transferred to the blender, I'm just going to add in some coconut oil. And I have about like 2 or 3 tablespoons here. As Alicia Silverstone would say, I just go with instinct. It usually works out all right. So we're just gonna put like 2 to 3 tablespoons in there for now. You don't need an exact measurement anyway. The reason I just go with a good amount is I want them to be nice and creamy. And this is gonna add a fat content to this dish. And that's gonna give you that like creamy, like buttery kind of texture that you would get in a traditional sweet potato, which we would probably use like butter in or something like that. The other ingredient that we're gonna put in here is just some local sea salt. And with this, we're not gonna do too much to start because you can always add more, you can't take it out. So I started with probably about like a heavy teaspoon, and we're definitely gonna need a little more, but I wanna taste it before I add too much. So we're gonna get this blended and then we're gonna give it a taste and see what it needs. So we've given these their initial blend. They're not quite the texture that I'm going for yet, but I did, as I said earlier, I know I'm gonna need a little more salt in here, so I wanna taste test it before I finish blending it. Those are really close to perfect, but they do need just a little bit more salt. That'll add just a little more, as I say, the salt really blooms the flavors. So we're gonna add probably like another teaspoon of salt. And ooh, maybe we can see this on the close-up camera, but you can see the texture of that beautiful sea salt and the way it looks like a little pyramid almost. And so I love that you can really see like the beautiful natural texture of the salt as well as the beautiful mineral content as well. So I added that pinch of salt and I gave these sweet potatoes another blend, and now they are right where I want them. They are super creamy, they're salty, they're delicious, and they're just looking perfect. So we're gonna let them just hang out and we are gonna work on our Demi Glace, which is really close to done already. So our Demi Glace is doing exactly what we want it to do, which is getting to a beautiful, thick, caramelized, almost like tacky state. You can see when I'm picking up my whisk here, I'm getting some really great caramelization sticking to the whisk, and that's exactly what we want. We want all of that collagen to be thickened and giving us that beautiful, like, demi-glaze texture. And so instead of adding butter to get that richness, we are just relying solely on that collagen, and it looks like it is really, so it's literally caramelized. As you can see here, we've got these beautiful bubbles happening, and that is creating that deep, rich flavor. And this also means that we've cooked off most of the liquid. So that's what's giving us this richness here, is instead of the collagen being just a small part of the liquid, we've burned off most of the water so that most of the liquid in here is collagen. And this is beautiful. So you've got this great, you can see it's sticking, it's thick, it's delicious. It's gonna be so good on this steak. So we're gonna take this off of the heat and we're just gonna let that hang out for a minute until it's time to finish our dish with it. All right, so we have all of our pieces together here and we are ready to put this beautiful plate together. I am a big believer that we eat with our eyes first, so even when I'm just cooking for myself at home, I always like to plate things beautifully and set myself up with a restaurant quality meal. And a great way to make everything feel special is to make it look beautiful and make it look extra special. And I think that taking the time to cook for yourself and making something that is going to be delicious and nourishing and something that's healthy for you is definitely something that is a special occasion. And you should make it so by making your plate look special, and it's really easy to do. So what I just did here is I made like a little pile off to one side of my plate, and I just put my spoon down and I spun the plate to create this little restaurant style swirl that you see. And I'm just gonna top this off with some pieces of steak. And what I like to do is I like to kind of create these little twisty ribbons of steak. And the reason I do that is that it creates more little pockets for sauce, which is always my favorite part of any meal. So I'm gonna keep these guys twisted up and just arrange them in a little pile here. And I'm gonna start the pile in, I started it on the wrong side originally, so I want the pile to be a little more in the middle here of the thicker part of my sweet potatoes. And that's so we have a little bit of a well to catch the sauce, and then it's also gonna kind of cascade over it as well. So add one more piece of steak there. I think that looks nice. We've got a little height on the plate, which I think always helps elevate things literally, and it just makes it look nicer. That's one of the little tricks you see in restaurants. You think your plates always look so beautiful at a restaurant. They always have height on them, and that's one of the big reasons they look so nice. This Demi glaze is just the bone broth reduction. This beautiful, thick, rich collagen in here. And so I'm gonna go ahead and just scoop a little bit of this beautiful reduction. Look how thick and beautiful that is. And that's literally just bone broth. All we did was reduce it down. So we're gonna add a little drizzle of this over our steak, and that looks so good. It's so thick and so delicious. I cannot wait to eat this. So we've got a little more. Oh, the sauce came out so perfect. So let me just move this here. And we've got that beautiful rich sauce going on there. So I think that's enough sauce, although there's never really enough sauce in my opinion. So we have our steak, we have our sweet potatoes on there. I'm gonna finish this with just a teeny bit of salt because, as I mentioned, a finished salt flavor and a cooked salt flavor are two different things. So we're gonna get a little beautiful finishing salt on there, and we're gonna do some microgreens. I love microgreens because they're a great way to get just incredible nutrient density without having to eat like an entire bag of kale. So microgreens are these little sprout guys, and they have tons of nutrients in them. So you can eat a bowl of this is like eating a mixing bowl of lettuce. So you're gonna get, it's a beautiful garnish, but you're really getting some nutrients out of this as well. And again, with that diverse colors, diverse nutrients, we have different color microgreens in here from different types of plants. So we're getting just more diverse nutrients, which is always gonna leave you feeling more satisfied. So we'll get just a nice little bundle of these, and we'll tuck that in right here. I think that looks nice. And then maybe a couple guys scattered around. So that's it. That's our steak dinner. And you can see it looks beautiful. It looks vibrant. We have that gorgeous orange sweet potato. We have that beautiful glaze, which again is just bone broth, which is so good for you too. It's great for gut health, all those things. It's good for your skin. It's great for your hair. So many benefits. So this is the dish. It's put together. It's beautiful. This is something that you can make at home on a weeknight. It doesn't take a ton of time and effort. It's also a really great recipe for entertaining. As you can see, it looks impressive, even though the techniques that we worked with were super simple. I think we literally had like 4, 5 ingredients here today. So really easy and really rewarding. And I am so excited to give this a try. So now's my favorite part of cooking in the kitchen, when I get to enjoy the fruits of my labor, and I already know I love this dish, but I'm excited to give it a try today. I'm gonna do a little bite with you guys, and then we can talk about it. So in this bite, I've just got a little bit of my steak. I've definitely got a good bit of that Demi glaze, and I'm gonna get a little microgreen in there too. It's so good. It's everything I was wanting it to be and hoping it would be. It's sweet, it's savory, it's salty. You have those little bitterness from those greens. It is perfectly balanced. And that demi glace is so rich and so delicious. It's really hard to believe that it's just bone broth, but when you know the quality of that bone broth, it's really not that hard to believe. So I am gonna enjoy the rest of this plate. I really hope that you guys enjoy making these recipes at home, and you can find, as I mentioned, I don't really do recipes, but I do make them. I do put them out on the website to make life easier for you guys, but it's a conversation with the food, so remember that. We're always just kind of looking for those markers that we talked about. We're looking for falling apart sweet potatoes. We're looking for beautiful caramelization on the outside of the steak. We're not necessarily timing things. You'll be able to find the recipe through the link that's attached to this video. And remember though, recipes are really just a guide. It's about the conversation with the food. It's about having fun in the kitchen. So don't get hung up on the recipes. Just have fun. Remember to have a conversation with your food. You're looking for that beautiful caramelization. You're looking for falling apart sweet potatoes. It's way less about making sure the timer is set right. So remember, have fun first and foremost, and I am so excited to cook with you guys again.